I'm surprised at how much traffic this video series has been getting already. Although, something I'm not surprised about is that there's been some mixed results with what I've been talking about. Although, for this episode, I'm not going to be focusing as much on criticizing capitalism as I am going to be going over something that I agree with capitalists on. There's a reason that I titled this series Christian Economics rather than something else like Conservative Christian Criticizes Capitalism. Because although I am criticizing capitalism, that's not the entirety of what this series is about. So for this episode, I'm going to go over not really a solely capitalist idea, but an idea that a lot of capitalists have that I agree with. That being, those who don't work don't eat. For people who are able to contribute to a society, have it be mandatory for them to work so that they are not being entirely a burden on society. I don't have as much scripture that I'm referencing in this episode, although I do have one passage from Second Thessalonians. The verse I'm going to highlight is Second Thessalonians 3:10. For even when we were with you, we used to command this to you. If anyone is not willing to work, neither let him eat. Second Thessalonians chapter 3 backs up what the capitalists are saying in this regard, that we should be working. But there are some non-capitalists out there that are saying that work should not be mandatory to earn one's food. Instead, they want an economic system where people's basic living needs are already provided for them. But then there's the big question that they get asked about: how are they going to then be incentivized to do their work? If people can have a comfortable living standard without working, then what motivation would they have to work? I'm sure there are more arguments to this that I'm not going to be debunking in this video, but I'm going to bring up three of the arguments that I've heard. Argument number one from this person was that if we switch to a different economic system where people are not being as exploited, that they don't need to work as many hours overall. And thus, the idea is if they have to work only, say, 5 or 6 hours a day instead of 8 or 10 hours per day, then it is a lot more easy to convince them to put in the daily work. But for this argumentation, I'm hesitant because about the very claim that they are building this upon. I see the theory, but I'm not convinced that theory is the way that it works. And yes, I've heard people say that in this post-industrial age that we are able to maintain a higher living standard without doing as much work as our ancestors did before the Industrial Revolution. But I don't think that we should be assuming that this is how it's going to keep on going in the future. That is, if it's even that significant of a decrease in demand in work at all. Because remember, even though we have a lot more industrial output, a single individual can produce a lot more than a worker a few hundred years ago could. We also have more expenses. People a few hundred years ago didn't have to pay for gasoline. If you go back thousands of years, people were a lot more concentrated closer to the equator where the climate was a lot warmer. They didn't need to heat up their houses. They didn't have as much industrial byproducts that were harmful to the environment. To be fair, I do think that we don't need to work as much to maintain that living expenses demand. I think overall the Industrial Revolution, under a proper economic system, makes a worker's life at least some amount easier. But I would be skeptical if the amount is enough to enable workers to only work 5 or 6 hours a day, down from the standard 8. The second argumentation I've heard for why we should allow free loading, strangely, although this secondary argument I disagree with its conclusion, it still uses a statement that I agree with to a certain extent. The statement goes that people want to work, they just don't want to work for you. Now, what does this statement mean? I don't think it necessarily means like people want to be their own boss all the time. What the statement is more so going after is that people have a lot less work motivation when their bosses are exploiting them. If you want your workers to be working better, then have an expectation on yourself. Give them a more reasonable wage. I'm not saying every boss in America is like that, but it's just something to keep in mind. But back to the argument, does that mean that this statement could be carried to an extent of you think people are going to still work even if they can freeload? I still do not think that this would be the case. Personally, I feel very blessed by God to be working with my dad and my brothers in a local family business. I'm happy with the wages that my dad gives me. The hours at the company are flexible. I'd say overall, I am very content with the workplace that I'm at. I'm very glad that it's the type of place that I get to go for 40 or more hours a week in work. Admittedly, I do think that work would be a lot harder if I was working with more people that were less ethical. But I got some news to break to you. Even at the place I work, there are still days where the work is hard. There are days where a major motivation for me to continue on working when it's 1:30 in the afternoon post lunch and I still got multiple hours left in the day before I get to clock out. A major motivation I still have there is working, even during that bitter work, for my pay. The third argument that I've heard for why we should let people freeload is that, well, have you ever had this happen to you? You go on, say, Thanksgiving or Christmas break, you get back from the holidays, and during that holiday season, you're actually thinking to yourself, wow, I got like nothing to do. I really want to get back to work. I've had that happen to me. I know what it feels like. The idea is that not working for that extended period, it gets rather unbearable. We as humans, a lot of us like to be productive. And again, I see what this argument is saying, but I don't think this occasional urge that we get, like we really want to go into work, I don't think that comes around often enough for it to be a regular motivator for us to do our work. Even once I get back to my job after a holiday break, it is very simple. To a few days of being back to work, I'm already okay again with clocking out at the end of the day. And actually, this stuff aside about the argumentations for why some people believe that workers would still be willing to put in labor even if they have the option of just freeloading the economy, there's something that I would point out, not like with a specific one of these arguments or some other argument here or some other argument that I didn't cover here. How about I address the conclusion of these arguments? Because I've thought about this. If you think that workers would be willing to work even if they were allowed to freeload, why do you even want freeloading to be an option? Why are you against work being mandatory if you think that people will do it even if it's optional? The one argument I could imagine someone saying to what I just said is about some sort of mental pressure. The inner mentality of, if I don't do my work well enough, then I'm not going to have food on the table. But there are plenty of people throughout different cultures and history where they did not have this sort of psychological pressure. I think it's possible that there's some way out there to structure an economy where people are not stressed about whether they will be able to pay their bills. And I think they can do that while still having work be a mandatory contribution. And if we are talking about psychology here, there's a personal satisfaction that comes to my awareness for me. Being aware that the work I do is a direct contributor to me being able to pay what I'm spending my money on. Now, I will admit, I'm not at that stage of life just yet where I'm paying, like, say, rent. I hear that's a big bill that renters are paying, or groceries. But I do have many people in my personal life that are living independently of their parents, and they have still managed to make it work. Now, I'm aware about this sort of generational debate of the claim that Gen Z does not have as much of an economically secure future as their parents or grandparents did. But remember, even if you go back a few generations to, say, the boomers, Gen X, these generations, even though they lived under an economic system where work was mandatory, and that work being mandatory was not a huge psychological burden to them. And if we as non-capitalists believe that there are some people in the past who have lived, not even like upper class people, just more regular people, have managed to live without this psychological burden, even under capitalism. How much more then if there is a better economic system than capitalism out there? Now, I'm not going to be specifying in this video alternate theories that people have had of what alternate economic systems we could go to instead of capitalism, or even some theories that people have had of how to do capitalism differently. But overall, I think that work should still be mandatory, and that's okay.